March 27th, 1981. You know, folks, every once in a while you walk out here expecting the same kind of night you've done 1,000 times before. You straighten the tie, glance at the cue cards, hope Ed laughs at the first joke, which fortunately he usually does. The band is playing, the audience is ready, and everything feels exactly the way it's supposed to. That evening started just like that. We were talking about the latest headlines out of Washington. President Reagan had given another economic speech, and I was doing what I always did, trying to convince America that if we couldn't balance the budget, at least we could balance a punchline. The audience was laughing. Ed was shaking his head the way only Ed could, and it looked like another ordinary Friday night on television. Or at least I thought it was. About 7 minutes into the monologue, something happened that had never happened before. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Fred de Cordova walking toward me. Now, if you knew Fred, you knew one thing immediately. He never walked onto the stage during a live broadcast. Never. If he wanted something, he'd speak through the headset. If there was a problem, he'd solve it behind the scenes. So the second I saw him crossing the stage, I knew whatever was happening wasn't ordinary. The audience noticed too. The laughter faded almost instantly. Fred wasn't smiling. In his hand was a plain white envelope. Across the front, written in large, uneven letters that looked like they had been carefully printed by a child, were 4 words. Urgent for Johnny Carson. He leaned over quietly. Johnny, security thought you needed to see this immediately. Well, that'll wake you up faster than 3 cups of coffee. I looked at the envelope for a moment before opening it. The return address caught my eye first. Timothy Hudson, age 8, Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. Suddenly, every joke I'd been telling didn't seem very important anymore. I looked out at the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, I hope you won't mind if we pause for just a minute. Something arrived here that feels like it deserves our attention. Nobody objected. In fact, you could have heard a pin drop. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The writing wasn't perfect. Some of the words leaned sideways. Some letters were much larger than others. You could tell an adult had probably helped with a few difficult words. But you could also tell every sentence came from an 8-year-old boy. I started reading it to myself. Halfway through, I stopped because I realized I wasn't going to make it through silently. I folded the page for a second, took a breath, and looked back toward the audience. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I think this needs to be read out loud. The room became even quieter. This is from a little boy named Timothy. I unfolded the letter again. Dear Mr. Carson, my name is Timothy, and I am 8 years old. Already the audience was listening differently. I have leukemia. The doctors say I might only have a few weeks left. You could actually hear people breathing. I watch your show every night with my mom and dad, even though it's after my bedtime. Mom lets me stay awake because for 1 hour we forget we're in the hospital. Folks, when you read something like that, you don't read it as a television host anymore. You read it as another human being. The letter continued. I wanted to tell you thank you. You make people laugh every night. You make my mom laugh. You make my dad laugh. And when they're laughing, they don't look so worried. I had to stop for a second. Not because I forgot the words, because I was trying to see them. The audience understood. Nobody rushed me, nobody applauded, nobody made a sound. I looked back down. My mom says heaven is beautiful, but I'm still a little scared because I've never been there before. That line, I'll admit, hit me harder than almost anything I'd ever read on television. The next sentence somehow made it even more remarkable. I have one wish before I go. I want to make people laugh, just like you. I smiled through tears. Leave it to an 8-year-old to remind all of us why comedy matters. Then came the request. I want to tell one joke on your show, just one. So maybe when people remember me, they'll remember I made them smile. There was another pause. Not from me this time. The entire audience seemed frozen. The letter ended with something that sounded exactly like something an optimistic little kid would write. I know you're probably very busy. If you can't do it, I understand. But my dad always says, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Then, thank you for helping my family laugh. Your friend, Timothy. And finally, one last line. P.S. I'm really good at knock-knock jokes. I slowly folded the paper. For the first time in a very long career, I didn't know exactly what to say. Ed McMahon was wiping tears from his face. Several members of the crew weren't even pretending they weren't crying anymore. I looked directly into camera 1. Timothy, if somehow you're watching tonight with your mom and dad, I want you to hear me. You don't have to wait to make people smile. You already have. And as far as I'm concerned, you're officially invited onto this show. Then I turned toward Fred. Can we find Children's Hospital? I'd like to talk to Timothy. Fred didn't answer with words. He simply nodded and disappeared backstage as fast as I'd ever seen him move. For the first time in Tonight Show history, everything else suddenly seemed capable of waiting. We went to an unscheduled commercial break, and let me tell you, backstage didn't look anything like television usually does. People were moving in every direction at once. Producers were on telephones. Stage managers were talking over one another. Someone was trying to reach Children's Hospital. Someone else was coordinating with the control room. And every few seconds, somebody would look over at me as if to ask, "Are we really doing this?" My answer never changed. "If Timothy wants to make people laugh," I said, "let's give him his stage." A few minutes later, someone handed me a telephone. Fred leaned over and quietly said, "We've got him." I nodded. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3. The red camera light came back on. I was sitting behind my desk holding that telephone instead of my cue cards. The audience was completely silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "I think we have a very special guest with us tonight." I lifted the receiver. "Timothy?" There was a tiny pause. Then, through the speaker, came the voice of a little boy. "Hello?" "Hi, Timothy," I said gently. "This is Johnny Carson." Another pause. Then I heard something that sounded equal parts excitement and disbelief. "Really? Is this really Mr. Carson?" "It sure is, buddy. I just finished reading your letter. I wanted to call you myself." For a second, neither of us spoke. I imagine he was trying to believe this was actually happening. Truth be told, so was I. Finally, he asked quietly, "You really read it?" "I read every word, and I think America heard every one of them." The audience responded with soft applause. I could hear another voice in the background, probably his mother, someone encouraging him. I smiled. "So, Timothy, I've got a question." "Okay. Your letter says you're pretty good at knock-knock jokes." "I am. I've been looking for a good comedy writer around here." That finally earned a laugh from the audience. "So, do you think you're ready to tell your joke?" There was another tiny pause. "You mean right now?" "Right now." "On television?" "On live television." I looked around the studio. "As a matter of fact, I think about 20 million people are waiting." The audience applauded again. I could almost hear Timothy smiling through the phone. "I think I'm ready." I leaned back in my chair. "All right, the stage is yours." He cleared his throat. "Knock, knock." I answered immediately. "Who's there?" "Interrupting cow. Interrupting cow, wait. Moo!" He shouted the punchline before I could finish, exactly the way the joke is supposed to work. For just a second, the entire studio exploded, not with polite laughter, real laughter, the kind that starts in one corner of the room and spreads until everyone is wiping tears from their eyes. Ed McMahon nearly fell out of his chair. The band was laughing. Even the camera operators were trying not to shake the cameras, and I laughed too. A big, honest laugh. "Timothy," that was perfect. "You got me." His little giggle came through the receiver again. That laugh. I'll never forget it. "How does it feel?" I asked him, "knowing you just made millions of people laugh?" He answered without hesitation. "It feels really good." "Thank you, Mr. Carson." I shook my head. "No. Thank you." Then I stood up. I looked toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think our newest comedian deserves something." Without anyone needing to be told, the audience rose to its feet. Every single person. The applause filled the studio. It wasn't the usual applause after a celebrity interview. It wasn't applause because somebody had promoted a movie. It was applause for courage, applause for hope, applause for an 8-year-old boy who wanted nothing more than to make strangers smile. I held the receiver away from my ear. "Timothy, can you hear that?" "Yeah, they're clapping. They're standing. And every one of them is applauding you." The ovation continued, longer than anyone expected. When it finally settled, I picked up the phone again. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "You said in your letter you wanted people to remember your joke." "I think that's already happened." "But I'd like to do something else." He sounded curious. "What?" "I want to help children who are spending their days in hospitals. I want them to have books. I want them to have games. I want them to have things that make them smile when they're having a hard day. Then I smiled. And if it's all right with you, I'd like to name that effort after you. There was complete silence in the studio. The Timothy Hudson Fund. So every child who needs a reason to laugh gets one. His voice became very quiet. You'd really do that? I would. And I promise you, this isn't just television. I mean it. He took a slow breath. I think that would be really cool. The audience smiled through tears. I glanced toward Fred. Even he was wiping his eyes. Well, I said, I guess we've got ourselves an agreement. I guess we do, Timothy answered. His voice sounded softer now, tired, but happy. I knew he needed to rest. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to get some sleep. And your only job tonight is to keep thinking of more jokes. He laughed one more time. I can do that. I had a feeling you could. Then he said something that brought the room to complete silence again. Thank you for letting me be on your show. I swallowed hard. No, Timothy. Thank you for reminding all of us why we laugh in the first place. Good night, buddy. Good night, Mr. Carson. The line quietly clicked. For a few moments, I simply sat there holding the receiver. No music, no applause, just silence. Sometimes silence says more than anything a comedian ever could. I slowly placed the phone back onto the desk, looked around that studio, and realized none of us would ever forget what had just happened. For a long moment, nobody in that studio moved. The audience wasn't waiting for another joke. They weren't waiting for the next guest. They were simply sharing one quiet moment together. Finally, I cleared my throat. You know, folks, I walked out here tonight thinking we'd spend an hour laughing. I never imagined an 8-year-old boy would remind all of us why laughter matters in the first place. I reached for my handkerchief, and there wasn't much point pretending I wasn't emotional anymore. I've spent years sitting behind this desk talking with presidents, movie stars, athletes, musicians, and just about every interesting person you can imagine. But tonight, I think our greatest guest never even walked through the curtain. The audience answered with gentle applause. It takes a special kind of courage, I continued, to think about making somebody else smile when life has given you every reason not to. And that little fellow just showed every one of us what real courage looks like. The show eventually continued, but if I'm being honest, it never really returned to normal. The jokes landed, the guests came out, the band played. Yet everyone in that building knew the evening would always be remembered for one telephone call. By the time the broadcast ended, something remarkable had already begun. NBC's switchboard was flooded with calls. Thousands of people wanted to know one thing. How can we help? Some wanted to send toys. Others asked where they could donate. Many simply wanted to write a letter to Timothy and tell him that his joke had made them smile. Within 24 hours, support poured in from every direction. Donations began arriving for Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Letters filled with encouragement arrived by the thousands. Families mailed books. Teachers organized collections. Children sent hand-drawn pictures. People who had never met Timothy somehow felt they already knew him. The response grew larger every day. Within a week, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been raised to help hospitalized children. More importantly, thousands of messages arrived carrying something money could never replace. Hope. For the next 3 weeks, Timothy continued receiving visitors. Comedians stopped by with new jokes. Actors came to shake his hand. Ordinary families visited simply to thank him for reminding them that courage sometimes comes in the smallest voices. I visited him twice. Those visits weren't television. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience, just conversations. Sometimes we'd tell jokes. Sometimes we'd talk about movies. Sometimes we'd simply sit quietly together. One afternoon, he handed me a drawing. It showed the two of us standing on the Tonight Show stage. He had carefully written one sentence across the bottom. Thank you for making my dream come true. I looked at it for a long time. Then I thanked him. The truth is, I wasn't sure he realized he'd done exactly the same thing for millions of people watching at home. That drawing stayed with me. It remained in my office for years. Whenever work became stressful or television started feeling too much like business, I'd glance over at it and remember that entertainment is never just about ratings. Sometimes it's about giving somebody one good memory. 3 weeks after our conversation, Timothy passed away peacefully. News of his passing spread quickly. People across the country mourned a little boy most had never met. His funeral brought together family, friends, hospital staff, entertainers, and countless strangers whose lives had been touched by one knock-knock joke and one extraordinary letter. Promises matter. I had made one on national television, so I intended to keep it. The Timothy Hudson Fund was established to provide hospitalized children with books, games, art supplies, television programs, and visits from entertainers who could brighten difficult days. It began with a personal contribution. Soon, viewers added their own support. Year after year, the effort continued growing. Hospitals expanded programs centered around laughter, creativity, and play. Volunteers discovered that sometimes healing isn't measured only by medicine. Sometimes it's measured by the sound of a child laughing in a hospital room. As the years passed, that little drawing became more than a keepsake. It became a reminder that one voice, no matter how young, can inspire millions. Long after my own television career ended, people still asked about the most unforgettable moments I'd experienced behind that desk. They expected stories about famous actors, political leaders, legendary performers. Instead, I always found myself remembering an 8-year-old comedian with perfect timing. Because that's exactly what he was, a comedian, someone who understood that making another person smile is one of the greatest gifts anyone can give. Years later, people would still repeat his knock-knock joke. Not because it was the most sophisticated joke ever written, but because they remembered the little boy who told it with such joy. Every time someone laughed while telling that story, Timothy's wish came true all over again. Sometimes people think television changes history through great speeches or dramatic interviews. Maybe. But every now and then, it changes because one child decides to ask a simple question. Can I tell one joke? That night reminded me that the most meaningful moments are rarely planned. They arrive quietly, in a handwritten envelope, with uneven letters, and a message that reaches farther than anyone could have imagined. As I looked out across the audience that evening, I realized none of us had witnessed the end of a story. We had witnessed the beginning of one, a story about kindness, about courage, about generosity, and about the remarkable power of making another human being laugh. If there's one lesson I carried home that night, it was this. Never underestimate a small act of hope. Never assume your voice is too small to matter. And never forget that sometimes the greatest performance isn't delivered under bright lights. Sometimes it's shared through a telephone by a child whose only wish is to leave the world smiling. That's a lesson worth remembering. Good night, everybody.